It helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, this was a week in which the legislature continued its divided ways, and the Secretary of State said he will not run for re-election. The monuments issue continued to simmer. The parish presidency became an issue in the Jefferson Parish sheriff's race, and the French Quarter was reported to have a glut of residential properties. Yet all of that, in the end, was overshadowed by the death of Tom Benson. We'll discuss all of these stories, as well as the career of the man who kept New Orleans a big league town. Joining us are tonight's Informed Sources, Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Jeremy Alford, publisher, LaPolitics.com, Kevin Litton, reporter, NOLA.com, The Times-Picayune, and James Gill, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate. Over to Errol first, and of course, you know, we've all been greatly saddened by the death of Tom Benson.
Yeah, I have actually a few stories to tell, because I know a lot of people are talking about them in different angles. And there's one story that just surfaced this afternoon. I think it's fairly interesting. It's from Sean Payton, who quickly did an article for Sports Illustrated. And I never knew what the relationship between the two men was. A lot of times a coach wants to be as far away from the owner as he can. But it turns out they had a personally close relationship. That Peyton said every morning he'd go in, he'd sit in Benson's desk. Benson had a little bowl of Hershey's Kisses, and then they'd do that, and they'd talk, and he'd give him advice. But he said what really solidified the relationship was when they had the Bountygate scandal. That Peyton revealed that there were really forces within the NFL that wanted Benson to fire Peyton. He was getting a lot of pressure. And Benson said, I'll have none of that. And that he always respected the way that Benson stood behind him in the whole thing. And so he was very, very close to him, which I just thought was an interesting story. Something that came to mind, a story that Tom Benson liked to tell, was that in 1985, John Meekum had the franchise, and Meekum wanted out. And the city looked close to losing the franchise. Jacksonville didn't have a team at that time, and there's a lot of money in Jacksonville. And there was a group that wanted to buy the franchise and move it to Jacksonville. And there really wasn't any big money that was surfacing out of New Orleans. So Edwin Edwards got involved. And the story that Benson liked to tell is that Edwards called him and said, Tom, look, I got a bunch of investors getting together. Could you come to Baton Rouge and let's talk, see if we can get something? So Benson said, I went over there to meet with a bunch of investors, and it turns out I was the only investor he had. He had someone. And so they put together a deal, and he was the major investor originally, had a lot of partners, but once it was done, he eventually bought out his other partners and quickly became the sole owner of the franchise and started developing the franchise. But when he took over, there wasn't much enthusiasm because first, not a lot of people knew him. A lot of his business at the time was in San Antonio, and the idea of selling the team to a car dealer just didn't sound right. He was just a guy that was a stranger to the people in New Orleans. But
Edwin Edwards actually didn't think he was from here. I was at the announcement, and he said he was sorry that he had to go to a guy from Texas. And Benson said, hey.
Right, he's quite a New Orleans boy.
Not only was he from Texas, he was from Gentilly. And he was very proud of Gentilly. You know, this birthday party, they had a big birthday party for him. I think it was in July, and I got to talk to him, and I think one of his relatives just briefly. And he talked about St. Roch Church in Gentilly. And they said they'd go to the 4 o'clock Mass there each week. Okay, well, it turns out the 4 o'clock Mass was the 4 o'clock in the morning Mass on Sundays. Okay. It was a Mass that they had for fishermen who were going out, or for people who were going out to the French Quarter that night who were coming back. And so it was the combination of those two. But there was a couple of times when I thought that Benson must have felt very, very lonely. And I think one was after the 1999 season. This was a disaster. The team went 3-13. Mike Ditka was the coach. The team was so bad that Benson, during the season, actually put out a full-page ad in the newspaper apologizing. The day after that season ended, that Monday, he fired everybody. He fired the coaches, the assistant coaches, the front office, the ticket people, just everybody. They used to have this dog that would go and get the tea.
Remember that retrieval dog?
He was fired too. Okay, I mean, they got rid of everybody. I think for one guy, and of course all the media were all over him. They're like, you had an awful season. Now you don't even have an operation anymore. And I said, this guy must really be lonely tonight on all this. But from that, he built a team. The next year they had a winning season, and they got into the playoffs, and they got into their first playoff game. And so he had an ability to bounce back. And then, of course, the worst had to be in 2005, after Katrina, and when the team had to relocate to San Antonio. And there was a lot of, and the mayor of San Antonio didn't help, because the mayor of San Antonio was sort of like dancing on New Orleans' grave, right. Suggesting, well, the team's not going back to New Orleans, they're coming back here, and Benson wasn't really forceful in denying that. So there were a lot of people that were very angry and very nervous, thinking that the team wouldn't come back. And here, I think Paul Tagliabue, the commissioner of the NFL, gets a lot of credit, because people tell about this famous meeting where people sat down and he says, "You're coming back to New Orleans." But in fairness to Benson, he didn't know if there would be a New Orleans. I mean, he didn't know if there'd be a population base. The dome had been devastated by Katrina, so he didn't know if he had a stadium or if he had people to come. And so that's a hard decision to make. And luckily, the NFL pitched in. And of course, that led to that miracle game, the first game of that season. Mm-hmm. It wasn't, the NFL didn't schedule the Saints to have a home game until the fourth game, so that they could finish fixing the stadium. So the first 3 Saints games that season were on the road, and they won all 3. Who'd have thought that? Okay.
Right.
And then they come into the 4th game, and that's the game we'll always remember as the Steve Gleason
block
punt game.
Yeah.
And the mood was just so great. People were just so excited. It was really just a moving night. And next to winning the Super Bowl, I mean, there was no more emotional moment. So you've seen these times when Benson was brought down to really in the pit of despair, but then things happened, and they always bounce back.
And he also, aside from being such an astute businessman and then building the Saints, and then also now the Pelicans as well, but he gave so much to the community too, to like Oxnard and to his alma mater, Brother Martin. Of course, he went to St. Aloysius, but which eventually became Brother Martin.
He did. Even today, in making the announcements about the funeral, which I think is next Thursday, they asked that in lieu of flowers, contributions be sent to Oxnard. And you have to really, a key part of the story, of course, is Gail Benson. Sure. Because once she became part of the picture, and supposedly during those hard days after Katrina, when everybody was against him, he didn't know what to do, she was very important in consoling him and telling him how to deal with the media and how to deal with the pressure. And really kept the situation steady. So she was really important, and she's important now. And in that, everyone's been quick to say that she's in charge of the operations now.
Right, and then of course last night there was an impromptu second line, a good way to say goodbye to Mr. Benson. Well, our condolences, of course, to Gail and to his entire family and his sports family, the Saints family, the Pelicans, and Godspeed, Mr. Benson, and thank you so much for everything you did for this community. All right, now let's talk about the legislature. What is going on there? Are we moving ahead with any legislation in this regular session?
The way you let that sigh out and you look at me with your rolled eyes, I think you know exactly what's going on at the Capitol.
Not enough.
I mean, look, there's a plan that has been coming together where lawmakers would adjourn the regular session early and then start a special session on that day and end on the adjournment of the regular on June 4th, so taxpayers wouldn't have to foot another bill for a special session. Yeah. Hopefully not another do-nothing special session like we just saw. But even that, there's uncertainty around that. It seems like the governor and the Senate president have agreed to a compressed timeline and even a resolution that would put this in writing. Meanwhile, the House is not, the Speaker says he agrees to that in principle. He agrees to a special session, but he's not going to put that resolution out and put it in writing. People are asking for things in writing. That is something at the Capitol. When we had Earl Long said never put anything in writing, but there are trust issues, and rightfully so. There are plenty of distractions in the regular session, unlike the special session. Lawmakers love shiny things, and there are a ton of bills that are going to be moving through the process. There's a major push for changes to gaming laws this week, equal pay, and a minimum wage bill made it out of a Senate committee. They're probably going to face the same fate in the House, though, which is failure. There are a handful of constitutional convention bills, one that's already passed a committee on the House side, but the main charge of the regular session is to pass a budget. And it's about as messy as it can get right now because it's not straightforward, and there's no guarantee that a budget will be passed by the end of the regular session.
How can you pass a budget when you don't know what the money is
You've
that
got
you
a
have to
firm
spend?
number.
Well, you can pass a budget, and this is exactly what
cut.
many Republicans want to do, is they would pass a budget with cuts in it. And then if they do come back in a special session, they can pass a supplemental budget. That's one way of thinking. But another big question looming over the session is how much is that shortfall? The governor just a couple of weeks ago was selling a $1 billion, nearly $1 billion shortfall, but we're going to get a $302 million bump from federal tax changes that could take it down to $700. And then the chairman of the House delegation, Lance Harris, released a video last night saying that he believes it's $500. I'm not sure that elected body could agree on what to order for lunch, more or less, what the number's going to be in that budget. We're going to have to wait and see.
So what about cuts? I mean, GOP says they want to see some cuts, but have they put on the table what the cuts are, or are they just going to follow the budget that the governor has submitted, which contains a lot of cuts?
Yeah, that's really been kind of a set of Democratic talking points, which is show me the cuts. Where are the cuts? Where would you cut? And we've seen individual lawmakers come to the table and present little ideas here and there. But I think that the most meaningful statement so far has been from Appropriations Chairman Cameron Henry, who again through a video and again through Facebook said that he called the Department of Health, that it was cannibalizing other agencies and departments. We've heard this kind of rhetoric before, but I think it's a clear signal that when appropriations does start going through those cuts, I think the Department of Health is going to be high on that list. They have a very, very large budget. There's probably some low-hanging fruit to cut there. There's probably some low-hanging fruit to cut all over the state. The question is that pile of fruit going to add up to $700 million or more?
And
I thought one of the more interesting things about the cuts this year is that in years past, a lot of the cuts were kind of theoretical. This year, they're talking about, UMC used to threaten, we're going to get out of our lease here in New Orleans if we get cut. They've got a letter out that says, let us out, And then you've also got letters that are going to go out to people in nursing homes and poor patients. That
Medicaid recipients.
Yeah, and that, I don't remember that going
Tops recipients. That has happened. It's part of some of it is part of the theatrics and the dog and pony show that is the Capitol. Both sides want to make their point, and the administration has the benefit of being able to get these departments and hospitals and university heads behind them. But that uncertainty makes it more real than I think we've seen in recent memory.
So they didn't meet today, Friday.
No. I was a little surprised by
Generally, they've been taking Fridays off, but they're going to try to have an abbreviated regular session.
That's
so
correct.
Don't they need the time?
Well, they're looking to maybe end in mid-May, and traditionally they take Fridays off, and you're talking about people who drive from around the state. That day is needed to not only go see your family, but also to catch up on business, catch up on district work. But we're in that. I was very surprised to see the legislature take Friday off, and I think they're going to take next Friday off too. I'm not sure that's sustainable for the rest of the session, though.
Okay, well, it remains to be seen what's going to be happening. I guess we'll hear from you in the weeks to come. Okay, thanks a lot. James, to you. You wrote a piece about the continuing monument saga after seeing our mayor in 60 Minutes.
Yes, he was on 60 Minutes repeating the lines he used at his Gallia Hall speech last year, and he's got himself a reputation as like a Demosthenes of Louisiana. You praise all over the place for his great oratory, in which what he said is hard to argue with. He was saying, like, slavery is bad, for instance,
Indeed.
And the Confederacy was on a wrong side of humanity and history, and so on and so forth. All indisputable, all worthy, if not somewhat platitudinous. But it occurred to me that nowhere does he acknowledge that the removal of these monuments have left these great holes in the cityscape, and there's a great feeling of regret in certain quarters. And the question I think we need to ask is why? They can't all be unreconstructed racial yahoos. There is. I think what we need to bear in mind is that to keep trashing the Confederacy, although, as I say, I'm not disputing what he says, I think we have to bear in mind that this is a city which suffered a great deal in the Civil War. We have a great collective memory of a great deal of death and destruction. And you think in terms of what the South suffered. Like the latest figures I've got are like 700,000 people died, and soldiers that is, in the war, which is equivalent to, say, 7 million today. So I think you need to acknowledge that just to constantly say that these people died for a cause that was ignoble or evil and so on, once occurred, there's another side of the coin. These are not people who marched off to war in conscious defense of slavery. These are people defending hearth and home. And I think that there are people, the families have passed down all these stories of their brave and dedicated forebears and so on. And I think we need at least to acknowledge that there is in a city, part of its heritage is indeed a feeling that the great sacrifices were made for the Confederate cause, unworthy though it may have been, as the mayor says. I think we at least need to acknowledge that there is some merit, some justification in these feelings of regret and sadness. I think that's all.
It's been a year.
They're all there. I mean, these are. I mean, the fact of the matter is that they got these disputes over what the Civil War is about. Whether it was just states' rights or slavery and so on and so forth. I don't think that those were issues at the forefront of people's minds. I think people respond to the call of duty. They put they marched off to war, and they put their life, and a lot of them died. And I think we need to just acknowledge that there's a lot of sacrifices were made, and that we need to be a little bit more sensitive to the sense of honour in their posterity. That's all.
That's basically what you said, and of course a year since the monuments now have come down, I mean the emotions are still out there, it's still simmering.
And I mean, remember on the very day that Lee came down, the last of them, that was the day that the mayor got on his hind legs in Gallia Hall and delivered his speech about the Confederacy and about how we are the melting pot, all the old cliches, they're true nevertheless. All those powerful points he made, and as I say, it was a very well received speech. But I just think there is. Let's acknowledge that there is another that what he called the searing truth. It may be, but it's not necessarily the whole truth. And I think we just need to give everybody a break here, and not be so smug and certain.
All right. If you haven't seen James's piece, go to theadvocate.com and take a look at it and read his column. All right, James, thanks. Going over to Kevin right now, and French Quarter, it's a place where people have always loved to live, rent an apartment there, but right now there's an apartment glut. I guess it's a good time to go if you feel you want to live in the quarter.
Yeah, it's really quite the buyer's market. It's a remarkable thing, I think, if you start paying attention to how many signs and listings that as you're going out there, especially in sort of the lower part of the quarter where there's always been traditionally more residential. Yeah. What we've really seen here is, I think, a case study in some ways of what happens when you do a full ban on short-term rentals. We don't have that in the rest of the city. And there's a lot of arguments that are going on in the commercial districts about uncapped rentals and how many days you can do it. Out in the Marigny, the Bywater, which are really popular for short-term rentals, they're really struggling with it. But then you got the French Quarter kind of standing alone, being that one place that nobody can do a short-term rental in.
It's against the law now to do short-term
rentals.
It is,
and I mean, you can see this showing up in the listings. I went into many of the listings, and they're listing apartments that are fully furnished with this beautiful furniture that you just know was put in there for a short-term rental, and they're not even bothering to take this furniture out, but they can't find renters, they can't find buyers, and then the buyers that have owned it are often investors who can afford to keep that property on the market for a long time, so they're not budging with the prices. So you're really not seeing much transactions going on at all. I thought one interesting thing that somebody brought up to me after the piece came out was they said, a lot of renters, or for that matter buyers, full-time residents, part-time residents, may not want to come here because the quarter has just gotten so crazy with the partying and the tourism and the shenanigans. And they said, well, let's think about this for a second. How did it get that way? Did it get that way because all of these rentals, all of these apartments where people used to live emptied out, and then we just had people that weren't there all the time? Because there is a sense of security that you have when these are lived-in homes. People sit on their stoops. People put their lights on. People call when they see things going on. And so they wonder if you could get people living in the quarter again, would that start to maybe get it a little bit under control? just to make it at least livable.
Well, of course, the quarter was the city's first neighborhood, and that's been the call of preservationists all along, and the cry of preservationists, and they're bemoaning the fact that it's losing that neighborhood fabric with all of the everything being really sort of catered to the tourists. Are we seeing any kind of move then to allow short-term rentals in the quarter?
I don't think they're going to go that direction given the council that's coming on next. I mean, many of those council members felt that they had a clear mandate from voters that they wanted to see things change. I think if you see anything change, that you're going to see it get stricter, probably certainly in areas like the Marigny and the Bywater, and the Treme is affected by this as well, because with the ban in place in the French Quarter, that's really putting a lot of pressure on those neighborhoods, as well as in the CBD. I mean, one of the things that's really remarkable about what's going on in the CBD right now is before the short-term rentals were a big thing, a lot of developers were starting to snap up outdated office properties and convert them to residential because they knew that the apartment market was growing. Nationally, multifamily is really the way to go. And many of those buildings that were converted to residential apartment buildings are now turning into basically hotels. I mean, there's
the short-term rentals.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, there's the one building that I know of, the Maritime, is almost half short-term rentals, and that just keeps going up. And they're allowed to do it uncapped as much as they want, and those all take apartments off the market.
But meanwhile, long-term renters also are looking to the CBD for newer properties, bigger properties, parking available, et cetera.
Yeah,
and that's hurting the quarter as well.
Yeah, I think it hurts the quarter to a certain extent because they can offer the parking, they can offer certain amenities. But, in many ways, that's a healthy thing. You want residents living in the CBD. You want them in the French Quarter as well. But, I think it's going to take a while before we start to find that balance.
Okay, all right. Thanks a lot, Kevin. I'm going to go over to Jeremy right now, and our Secretary of State says he's not going to run for re-election, but he's not stepping down either.
Right, and of course the backstory is that there's a lawsuit from an employee involving sexual harassment, and I think he probably made the right decision. He this is a public official who is supposed to keep our costs down for elections, supposed to have fewer elections. Just stick it out and take your lumps and don't run again. And that sounds like is what he's going to do. We actually published a three-part package last night in La Politics Weekly that was led up by journalist Sarah Gamar that looked at the increasing number of women who are going to be running for the legislature next year, and we took a deep dive on those races, but also took a larger look at the statewide landscape and this office in particular, and asked a question of whether or not this seat and the way it's become vacant creates an opportunity for a female candidate to step up with some successful messaging and to go after this statewide office. Let's not forget that the last time a woman held statewide office in Louisiana was when Mary Landry lost to Bill Cassidy in 2014. And so we're seeing some of those names already kind of bubble to the surface. You have Representative Julie Stokes, who ran for treasurer last year and had to abandon that bid for her cancer treatments. You have Mary Werner Leach, who is on the LSU Board of Supervisors, is said to be looking at it. Sharon Hewitt, meanwhile, has said she has been looking at running for governor. But that's obviously going to be an open seat, and it's interesting next year because we'll have a competitive race for governor probably. We're going to have an open seat for Secretary of State, and John Schroeder just kind of was sworn in as the new treasurer not long ago. So his race may be contested as well.
We need to acknowledge Kathleen Blanco, who was governor. Too.
Right.
So but Schechter became Secretary of State because of a vacancy when Jay Darden was elected lieutenant governor. So that is one of the special elections.
Yeah, and
the
he
pressure
was working in that office already.
The pressure for him to step down, I mean, how is it still there? There have been calls for him to step down.
There have been. Surprisingly, there have also been some of his longtime elected friends go on the record and offer, not asking him to step down and saying that it's something he has to work out. And, Tom Scheller had a press conference this week and stood in front of reporters and said, the truth resides somewhere in the middle, which is an interesting way to put it, but that he proclaimed his innocence, and he's going to see this through.
But then he also makes these bizarre statements like, I'm transparent with the press, doesn't take questions. Only God can judge me. Well, you have a lawsuit. I think there may be other judges involved here. I mean, these are things that if the public is a little confused or maybe disheartened by what they saw out of Tom Shedler, it's hard to blame them when you see a performance like that.
Well, for right now, though, he says he's staying and he's just not going to seek re-election. All right, quickly over to James right now. And there was some action in the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's race with the Fortunato making a statement regarding Mike Yenny.
Well, yes, first he said he was forced to go behind Yenny and would and be in favour of his re-election, and then when he realised that wasn't playing well with the voters, he changed his mind mighty quick. And I think what we have here is a race between two deeply unimpressive candidates, maybe because Lopinto, his opponent, made a bit of a fool of himself as well with this business of whether or not he he approved the surveillance of his opponent's meetings. But you know, I hear from people in the sheriff's office who despise Lopinto, and I hear from deputies who despise Fortunato. I don't hear from anybody who likes either one of them. So, and I think the polls are showing it's pretty much a toss-up right now, which I think confirms that impression.
Yeah, that's what one poll showed, was that it indeed was a toss-up.
Well, Fortunato was way ahead initially, but of course
kind of seen it go back and forth.
Yeah.
It's amazing the shadow of Yenny over these elections. There was a constable race that had a robocall where they tried to link one of the candidates to Yenny.
Yeah, I mean, the constable race. Who cares about that? Yeah.
Well, Fortunato says that what he's saying is that he feels that Yenny is doing a good job in running the parish.
That's what he says one day, and then the next day,
the first statement.
No, but the whole thing, I mean, it's all absurd. I mean, Fortunato has been the spokesman for 30 years and is boasting about his experience. You know, I mean, he's fought crime with press releases.
He's also been a deputy. He's been out there, and he was wounded.
But he has had a fairly...
Well, that's an exaggerated story too. But,
but he is. Okay.
And it's a long time ago.
In a week, the voters will go to the polls and make the decision. And right now, we're going to look ahead. Errol.
Okay. Expedia's website, which specializes in travel, did a listing this week of the 20 must-see literary sites in the world, and listed in that was New Orleans. They talked about the literary heritage and the writers and just the ambiance, and also the Tennessee Williams Festival coming up next week. And so that's an impressive list to be on.
That certainly is. Jeremy.
Well, of course, we have elections coming up next weekend. Royce Duplessis for the local House district has been endorsed by the Picayune, Gambit, and Helena Moreno. And I think a lot of folks are in Baton Rouge are watching that race and wondering if it ends in the primary or just goes to a runoff. But it seems like Duplessis is the guy. So I'm watching all those. We have another legislative race, too, in the Hammond area.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Kevin.
City Council next week, long awaited, 3 years in the making. They're going to finally decide what they want to do about the strip clubs on Bourbon Street. Stacey Head's taking the role on that. So the Planning Commission's kind of gone back and forth on how they view it. We'll see if Stacey changes her mind.
All right, thanks. James?
Very interesting court case coming up. A guy on South Liberty put up a mural featuring quotes from President Trump, which were regarded as, in his famous interview about how easy it is to hit on women. They were so outrageous that the city ordered it taken down because the public can't be exposed to remarks from Trump. Anyway, there's now a lawsuit. He's alleging his First Amendment rights have been violated. Interesting story.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, you guys. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
The firm of Bowen, McLeod and Britt helps both large corporations and small businesses with insurance, risk management, and employee benefits using the same values they've held true for over 30 years: knowledge, vision, accountability, and service. More information is at bmbinc.com.